Everything ever written about the walleye starts in the same place, the eyes. That glassy, marble-blank outward stare that turns a photograph into something faintly unsettling, like the fish is looking through you instead of at you. And nearly every article tells you the same thing about those eyes. The walleye has incredible night vision. It's a fish that sees in the dark. I want to spend the next 20 minutes convincing you that this is wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong in a way that quietly costs you fish every single time you go out. Because the walleye is not a fish that sees in the dark. Put a walleye in true darkness, and its vision collapses like almost everything else's. The walleye is something stranger, and far more useful to understand once you get it. It is an edge predator, a specialist in a razor-thin window of light where it can still see, and its dinner cannot. Get that one idea right, and everything about this fish reorganizes into a single clean picture. Where it lives, when it feeds, what color eats it, why the lake you love may be getting quietly worse for it. All of it. So let's actually look into those eyes. Because you really can tell almost everything about a walleye by looking into its eyes. The glow has a name, the tapetum lucidum, Latin for bright tapestry. It's a mirror-like layer sitting behind the retina. Light enters the eye, passes through the light-sensing cells, and instead of being absorbed and lost against the back wall, it strikes this reflective layer and bounces back through those same cells a second time. 2 chances to catch every photon instead of 1. That's the whole trick. In a cat, that second pass boosts light sensitivity by a wide margin. In a walleye, it does the same job, and it's why the eye flashes white-orange when your headlamp catches it at the boat ramp. That reflection is light the fish didn't need, leaking back out. Now here is where the standard story runs straight off the rails. If 2 passes are better than 1, then more darkness should be better. Right? It isn't. When researchers actually measured how far a young walleye could detect prey at different light levels, they found the exact thing the night vision myth misses. In total darkness, the fish's reaction distance shrank to almost nothing, about the length of your finger. As light climbed up into the range of deep twilight, that detection distance more than doubled. And then, as light kept rising toward full daylight, the advantage bled away again, not because the walleye couldn't see, but because now everything could. So the walleye's vision does not peak in the dark. It peaks at dusk, at that specific, narrow band of failing light scientists call civil twilight. And that is the entire secret of this fish, hiding in plain sight. Back in 1977, an Ontario fisheries scientist named Richard Ryder ran one of the most disciplined field studies in the history of walleye biology. He dove the same reef, only between 10 and 1, only on bright sunny days, taking light readings with a photometer every half hour, so he could strip out the noise of wind and cloud and isolate the one variable he cared about, light. And what he found was that light, not temperature, not season, not the moon, was the master switch on walleye behavior. His catch didn't trickle in evenly through the day, it detonated in a short window around sunset. The overwhelming majority of his fish came in that one narrow slot as the sun went down. That is not luck. That is the fish stepping into its advantage the moment the door opens. Here's the reframe I want you to carry to the water. When you fish the evening bite, you are not turning up the walleye's vision, you are turning down the vision of everything it eats. A yellow perch, a shad, an emerald shiner, these are daylight animals with ordinary eyes. As the light fails, their world goes blurry, then goes black. The walleye's world simply gets comfortable. You are not fishing the predator's strength, you are fishing the prey's blindness. The walleye lives in the gap between those two things, and your whole job, every cast, every trip, is to find that gap and put your bait inside it. And here's the part almost nobody tells you, because it turns the fish inside out. A walleye is not born hating light. It's born loving it. Freshly hatched walleye larvae are strongly drawn to bright light. One classic study clocked them preferring intensities you'd associate with a sunny afternoon, right up until about 8 weeks of age. Then something flips. The tapetum lucidum isn't finished at birth. It assembles itself over the fish's first year, only reaching its complete, mature form once the fish is around 5 inches long, and as that mirror comes online, the animal reverses. The same fish that chased the light as a fry now actively flees it as a juvenile, seeking out dim water measured in a handful of lux instead of thousands. Sit with what that means. The walleye's entire personality, its shyness in sun, its love of shadow, its dusk raids into the shallows, is not a preference it chose. It's a consequence of an eye finishing its own construction. The behavior doesn't build the eye writes the behavior. And the diet rides along for the trip. Fry pick plankton and insects out of the bright surface water, and right around the time the eye matures, at roughly 1 to 2 months old, they turn to hunting other fish and drop into the low-light ambush game they'll play for the rest of their lives. So once you see the walleye as an edge predator, you stop asking, "Where do walleye live?" and start asking a better question, "Where is the light doing something interesting?" Because that is where they'll be. Take stained water. Every walleye article says the same thing. Walleye love dirty water, and then stops. But there's a ceiling nobody mentions, and it matters. Ryder and the researchers who followed him found walleye don't just want turbidity, they want a specific dose of it. Model it out, and the sweet spot lands around a Secchi reading of roughly 3 to 10 feet. Enough stain to blind the baitfish, not so much that the walleye's own mirror runs out of light to work with. Clearer than that, and the fish get shoved into deeper water and shorter feeding windows. Muddier than that, and even the tapetum can't pull enough photons to hunt. It's an optimum. A window, not a slider. Aim for the middle of it. Now the famous walleye chop. Wind riffling the surface into that gray, broken texture veterans chase. Anglers treat it like a mood. Like the wind gets the fish going. Mechanically, that's backwards. The chop is not exciting the walleye. It's a dimmer switch, and it's aimed at the prey. A broken surface scatters and reflects incoming sunlight instead of letting it drive straight down into the water column. The light below drops, and the instant it drops, the baitfish lose their edge, and the walleye gains its window, in the middle of the afternoon. An overcast, windy day is not good walleye weather by superstition. It's a manufactured dusk. You've dragged the evening bite into noon. The same logic works in inches instead of hours. A walleye tucked into the shade of a boulder, a dock, a weed edge, a brake line, is sitting on a hard boundary between shadow and sun. It holds on the dark side and watches the lit side, where the baitfish are, brilliantly visible, and crucially, unable to see back into the gloom where the walleye waits. Every shadow line on your lake is a tiny dusk that lasts all day. That is why structure matters for this fish. Not because walleye vaguely like cover, but because cover manufactures the contrast window in a fixed spot you can return to, cast after cast, year after year. And if you want proof this is all about light and nothing softer, look at the walleye's smaller cousin, the sauger. Same family, same mirror, but tuned even further toward the dark. The sauger is built to hunt in even less light and even dirtier water than the walleye, which is exactly why saugers thrive in the big, muddy, current-driven rivers where walleye numbers thin out. 2 fish, 1 problem. How much light is too much? Solved at 2 different settings on the same dial. Now let's talk about the thing anglers argue about more than anything else, and get wrong more than anything else. Color. Walk into any tackle shop and you'll hear the standard advice. Throw natural colors, match the forage, greens and whites and perch patterns. That advice is built on a human's eyes, and the walleye's eyes are nothing like ours. When scientists put walleye photoreceptors under instruments in 1980, they found the retina is dominated by cells tuned to just 2 wavelengths, one peaking far out in the orange-red, around 600 nanometers, another in the green, around 530. And here's the kicker. They found no blue-sensitive cones at all, 0. The walleye is, functionally, a red and green machine that is essentially blind to blue. So the walleye is not looking at your lure and asking, does that resemble a real minnow? It physically cannot run that comparison the way you can. It's asking a dumber, far more useful question. Is that thing lit up in one of the 2 colors I can actually resolve? That's why the lures that have quietly dominated walleye fishing for generations aren't subtle naturals. They're gold, orange, chartreuse, and fire tiger. Those colors sit right on top of the walleye's sensitivity peaks. They are not natural. They are visible. And there's a second reason those warm colors win, and it stacks right on top of the first. In stained water, the exact water the walleye prefers, long wavelengths punch through and short wavelengths die first. Blues and purples get absorbed and scattered into the murk within a couple of feet. Reds, oranges, and that hot yellow-green carry much deeper. So in the walleye's favorite conditions, the warm end of the spectrum is both the part the fish sees best and the part that survives the trip through the water. Natural color was never the real rule. Visibility to a red-shifted, blue-blind eye in water that eats blue first. That's the rule. Fish it. So what do you actually do with all of this tomorrow on your water? It gets simple fast because you're no longer guessing at moods. You're managing one variable, light. Fish the edges of the day. The last hour before dark and the first hour of gray light after dawn are not a good time to try. They are the appointment. If you can only fish middays, fish the wind. Hunt the colored chop-blown shorelines where a mudline is forming, because that's your daytime dusk. Keep your presentation slow. In dim light, the walleye isn't chasing down a burning retrieve. It's reading contrast and subtle movement, and a slow, controlled bait gives it time to commit. Keep that bait near the bottom, but not buried in it. Walleye hold low and attack upward into a silhouette, which is why a leech or minnow on a jig, crawled along a rock reef or break line at 10 to 20 feet in the evening, is still the single most reliable walleye presentation ever invented. That upward attack habit is also why vertical jigging with a blade bait or spoon rules the ice. You drop a silhouette right down onto fish staring up at the last of the light. When the fish are scattered across big, featureless water, a Lake Erie, a lake of the woods, you switch from precision to search and troll a crawler harness or a bottom bouncer along the depth line that matches the season, right around 1 to 1.5 miles an hour, until you drag your baits through them. And mind the teeth. A walleyes aren't the wire cutters a pike carries, but they'll nick light line, so a 10 to 12 pound fluorocarbon leader buys you insurance without wrecking the presentation clear water demands. Now, a story. Because no fish teaches you the walleye's limits like the biggest one that may or may not have ever been caught. In August of 1960, on Old Hickory Lake in Tennessee, a plumber named Mabry Harper, fishing for catfish of all things, landed a walleye weighing 25 pounds, 4 ounces, 41 inches long. For a fish whose absolute ceiling in cold northern water sits around 29 pounds, and whose typical trophy is a 10-pounder, a 25-pound walleye out of Tennessee is, frankly, absurd. Which is exactly why it's been fought over ever since. In the 1990s, an analyst went back to the faded photographs, argued the fish in Harper's hands simply couldn't be 41 inches, and the record was stripped, handed to an Arkansas fish, a 2211 from Greer's Ferry. Then, years later, new photographs and sworn affidavits from the original game warden surfaced, and the record was reinstated. The IGFA, for its part, reportedly never pulled it from the book at all. I'm not going to tell you which side is right, because honestly, no one can be certain anymore. But I'll tell you why the story matters. It's a perfect fossil of how this fish works on the human mind. A truly giant walleye is so rare, so far outside what the biology normally permits, that when one appears we can't quite believe it, and we'll spend decades arguing about it instead of celebrating it. The walleye does not hand out monsters often. When it does, keep the photos honest, and keep the fish wet. Which brings me to the part of this fish's story that should genuinely worry you, because the walleye has already watched a close relative vanish. In Lake Erie, there used to be a second walleye, the blue pike, a slimmer, bug-eyed, blue-gray fish of the deeper, colder water. It was so abundant it was working-class food. Commercial nets pulled more than 26 million pounds of it in a single year in the 1950s. By 1959, that catch had collapsed to under 90,000 pounds. By 1964, dealers sold 200. In 1983, it was declared extinct. And modern genetics later showed the blue pike wasn't even a separate species, just a color form of the same walleye, which somehow makes it worse. We didn't lose a strange cousin. We bulldozed a whole branch off our own favorite fish, with overfishing and pollution, in about a decade. And here is the modern twist, the one that should reorganize how you hear the phrase, clean water. We all assume clearer lakes are healthier lakes. For a walleye, clearer water is a threat. Remember the thesis. This fish's advantage lives in low light and moderate stain. When invasive zebra and quagga mussels filter a lake, and they have now filtered vast stretches of the Great Lakes and countless inland waters, they strip out the stain and the plankton, and the water turns gin clear. In Mille Lacs, one of the most storied walleye lakes on Earth, average clarity climbed from roughly 8 feet to 11.5 feet across 2 decades, and walleye numbers slid right along with it. Clearer water shrinks the walleye's window. It hands more of the day back to the prey, and to sight-hunting rivals like bass. Stack a warming climate on top of a fish that wants water under the low 70s, and you have real, slow-moving trouble. It isn't all grim, and Lake Erie itself is the proof. The same lake that lost the blue pike is now, through careful, science-driven management, the greatest walleye factory on the planet. State biologists recently estimated something on the order of 180 million walleye swimming in it, riding a run of enormous hatches. Managed with the ghost of the blue pike firmly in mind, Erie shows the walleye will reward us richly when we respect what it actually needs. It just won't forgive us twice. So here's what I want you to take to the water. Forget night vision. The walleye is not a creature of darkness. It's a creature of the edge, the seam in time between day and night, the seam in space between shadow and sun, and the narrow slice of the spectrum between what it can see and what its dinner cannot. Everything that works in walleye fishing is just some way of finding that seam and laying your bait across it. Fish the last hour of light. Fish the wind-blown colored shoreline in the afternoon. Fish the shade line at the ragged edge of the weeds. Throw the gold and the chartreuse, not because they're pretty, but because they are the colors that exist inside this fish's eye. Do that, and you are no longer fishing on hope. You're fishing the one thing about this animal that is utterly, mechanically predictable: its relationship with light. The muskie feeds on a whim. The brown trout changes its mind with the hatch. The walleye keeps an appointment. Show up at the edge of the light, and more often than not it will already be there, staring back at you with those glassy, ancient, mirror-lined eyes, doing exactly what one missing blue cone and one reflective sheet of tissue have programmed it to do since the day its eyes finished growing. That's the walleye, not a fish that beats the dark, a fish that owns the edge of it. I'm Fishing Lab. Go fish the seam.